Hello to you and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran, here with episode 108 of season 3. In the last episode, titled The Loneliness of Tipu Sultan, I introduced the man as a forlorn, even lonely individual. Like most charismatic leaders of world history, no amount of studying him will enable anyone to fix a single label by picking one of his many attributes. Highly literate scholar, science hobbyist, battle-hardened warrior, and equally a fanatical tyrant capable of the worst brutality. To my mind, no single label will ever fit. In this episode, I pick up from the end of the Second Anglo-Mysore War, which resulted in British defeat and in the Treaty of Bangalore. Today, I look at something more real. How did Tipu Sultan, who inherited his position during wartime, manage to govern in peacetime? That has always been a challenge for governments. But before all that, first as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support that makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. That Tipu decisively beat the British in the Second Anglo-Mysore War was not the issue. The resulting peace treaty was. The Treaty of Bangalore was not a comfortable agreement, and as far as that resulting in peace, it's the same thing as two prize fighters who maintain the peace between rounds, watching each other, calculating, ready for the next round. Tipu Sultan had inherited the state of Mysore, whose institutions had been functioning almost entirely by war. Hyder Ali had built the Mysore state on the principle of military mobilization. All its fiscal systems collected revenues principally to feed armies. Its bureaucracy existed to keep the war machine supplied and moving. Its standing army was large, disciplined, battle-hardened, but very expensive. The trouble was that peacetime does not make such structures easier to maintain. In many ways, it actually makes them harder. A wartime economy and a peacetime economy operate on entirely different logic. You can't sustain war-level military expenditure when there's no war and it's stopped. Something had to give. And this fell to Tipu Sultan to figure out how and when to do what. Considering that the economies of nations around the world have had to adapt between war and peacetime economies, it is very interesting to look at how Tipu Sultan went about trying to get all this under control. So what Tipu chose to do in the years between 1784 and the start of the Third Anglo-Mysore War in 1790 was not to demobilize. He stabilized instead. And stabilization in Tipu's hands meant something very, very specific. It meant building a state and survive without needing war or conquest to pay for itself. Now, this is actually a more difficult problem than it sounds. Hyder Ali had spent decades winning territory. New territory brought new revenues, new resources, new soldiers. Conquest fed conquest. But Tipu, by 1784, was not in a position to expand easily. The British were watching, the Marathas and the Nizam were watching. Every move outward would trigger an immediate coalition response. The only direction that offered any room for expansion was inward. And inward is not invasion, but reform. The most visible of Tipu's reforms was what he did to the revenue system. Before Tipu intervened, much of Mysore's countryside was administered through palegars, hereditary military chieftains who originally had been granted land in exchange for providing soldiers to the state. Over generations, these palegars accumulated power that went well beyond their original function. They collected taxes from peasants at rates that they themselves set and remitted a fraction of what they collected to the state treasury, to the emperor. They maintained private armies, built their own fortifications, and operated as semi-independent powers within the kingdom. I have gone into this fairly extensively when I talked about Bertenstein and the segmentary state. You can find it in previous episodes. The result, however, was predictable. The state was always starved of revenue. The peasantry were always being crushed by these feudal lords, and the kingdom's administrative structure happened to be a loose federation of small-time despots rather than some kind of a coherent polity. So between 1786 and 1790, Tipu dismantled the old system methodically. He stripped the Paligars of their hereditary revenue rights and he replaced them with salaried officials. They were called amildars and tahsildars, designations we use even today, who were accountable directly to the central administration and who could be transferred or dismissed, and who were paid from the state treasury rather than getting money from what they could extract from peasants. So a peasant who had previously paid half his produce to a Paligar, who then handed only a fifth to the state, now paid roughly a third directly to the state, and everybody came out ahead. State revenues therefore nearly doubled. These revenue reforms carried out by Tipu had a strong fiscal logic, but this was the first systematized bureaucracy in a form that we recognized even today. There was an earlier attempt. The earlier attempt to create an efficient bureaucracy was by Chikkadevaraja Wadiyar, and it worked very well, but this was elevating everything to another level. While Chikkadevaraja had adopted the principle of the Atara Kacheri, lessons that he apparently had picked up from Aurangzeb, Tipu had established something that functions like a cabinet, a board of commerce with specific portfolios. He commissioned revenue surveys, and these surveys were of a detail unprecedented. In these surveys, officials measured land holdings, assessed soil quality, recorded irrigation sources, and catalogued crops village by village. He then instituted complaint procedures through which peasants could petition against corrupt officials. His regulations explicitly prohibited revenue collectors from using torture or any kind of coercion to extract payments, although this was a practice that had been entirely routine under all Paligar administrations. In Bangalore, which Tipu had developed as a major administrative and commercial center, he implemented the same direct assessment policies. He set up district courts, staffed by qazis and amins, adjudicated disputes between cultivators and state officials. The famous Mackenzie manuscripts record many cases where the peasants had won judgments against those officials. It was an institutional check on arbitrary power of officials, which in the hands of Paligars had been unrestricted and permissible because they were the feudal lords. Tipu then invested in the physical infrastructure of agriculture. For this, he constructed tanks, repaired irrigation channels, and built roads. In the Bangalore region alone, he is credited with having sponsored the construction of at least half a dozen new reservoirs and tanks and the restoration of ancient irrigation works. They were designed to put more land under cultivation, which would then generate more revenue, but the revenue generated by enriching peasants and the state simultaneously, rather than by squeezing one to feed the other. Tipu Sultan's 1787 administrative regulations were called the Al-Sirajia. They were so sophisticated that when the British captured them after the fall of Bangalore in 1791, they found little to replace. Thomas Munro and Alexander Reed, who had been tasked with administering the territories that Britain had taken from Tipu, were so impressed by the revenue system that they found that they used it as the foundation for the Rayatwari settlement. And that was a system that spread all across South India, and it influenced the methods of colonial revenue administrations for several generations to come. The British officers acknowledged their debt explicitly, even as official British narratives were busy constructing a portrait of Tipu as a fanatical tyrant. And now for a commercial break. Stay right where you are. I'm back in 30 seconds right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
For all its sophistication, though, Tipu's reforms had a cost. By dismantling the Paligar system, he also removed the hereditary intermediaries who had for centuries formed the political and social backbone of the Mysorean countryside. These chiefs had held their lands on the condition of providing military service. They were dangerous. Thomas Munro found that he would later have to manage some 30,000 of these armed retainers of former Paligars who were roaming the districts, but they were also so deeply embedded in local life and local loyalty. So when Tipu stripped them of their fiefs, he gained a more efficient state, but he lost that web of personal loyalty that had held it together in the system of the emperor and his feudal lords. Tipu tried to discount things like personal loyalty and try to replace it with something more modern, a bureaucracy of oaths, standardized processes, and transferable officials. It was rational, and it was indeed visionary for its time, but it also left him politically isolated in a way that Hyder, with his instinctive feel for personal relationships, had never been. And this is where Hyder's long shadow falls across this story. The year was 1771. Tipu Sultan was roughly 16 or 17 years old, already serving as a military commander under his father's authority during and just after the First Anglo-Mysore War. That's when Tipu Sultan made his entry. According to historian, chronicler Mir Hussain Kirmani, whose account remains the closest to a contemporary record of this period that we can find, Tipu had once disobeyed explicit orders during a military engagement in Chikruli. The precise nature of this disobedience is disputed. One version had him advancing too rashly against British positions. Another has him withdrawing from a position that his father Hyder Ali had ordered him to hold. Now, the two versions conflict on the details and the reason, but they both agree entirely on what happened next. I did describe this incident several episodes ago, but it bears repeating in the present context. This incident, the one of Tipu Sultan being publicly flogged, stands as one of the most striking moments in 18th century Indian political history. Although, like much of Indian political history, details remain frustratingly elusive. But the essential drama is beyond serious dispute. The heir apparent of Mysore was publicly whipped on his father's orders like a common soldier who had violated military law. Maybe the flogging was theatre, but theatre of a very specific and calculated kind. Think about all the soldiers and officers who witnessed it. The message to them was unmistakable. Military discipline superseded blood loyalty. Not even the commander's own son could disobey orders without harsh consequence. This was not incidental in an army that was built substantially on mercenaries and soldiers of fortune whose loyalty depended entirely on their commander's demonstrated willingness to reward success and punish failure without favoritism. Any perception that Tipu was protected by his father would have undermined Hyder's authority in the present, and also Tipu's capacity to command in the future. For Tipu, this lesson was more layered. The humiliation that he faced was designed to be formative rather than destructive to his character. What Hyder Ali was teaching him by subjecting his son to the same punishment as any soldier might receive was that power required the unflinching enforcement of discipline. A prince who had experienced the lash understood viscerally the machinery of command and the cost of defiance. It also served as political insurance. Hyder's position in Mysore had long been contested by factions who resented his displacement of the Wadiyar dynasty, even though he was not the one who had really displaced them. He was only the third of the Dalawais who had previously ruled Mysore by proxy. But still, because Hyder Ali was so visible, a lot of the blame went to him. Anyway, by demonstrating that even his own son was subject to military law, he signaled that his regime operated on principle and not privilege, even if hereditary succession was, in the end, unavoidable, and that Tipu would get the throne. What makes this episode particularly significant for me is to have read what followed. Tipu never repeated his offense. Whatever it was, he didn't repeat it. He became known for his fierce personal discipline, his physical courage, and his absolute insistence on obedience from subordinates. This flogged prince became a sultan who inspired in equal measure both devotion and terror. The contrast between father and son, though, is worth pausing on. Hyder Ali was wholly illiterate. He possessed a powerful memory and an acute political instinct that made him very difficult to deceive. He offered very easy access in court. He was known to be affable, had a gift of conversation, but he demanded that anyone who came to him state his business plainly. Once again, I love that story of the poet who arrived in his court and recited an elaborate tribute in his honor, and how Hyder Ali sat through the performance in stony silence, and when it was over, turned to Purnaya and told him to give that man some money and tell him to find some other work. Tipu Sultan was an entirely different creature. He was a connoisseur, an intellectual. After he died, when the British went to the palace and looked at what he had, they found a personal library of over 2,000 volumes in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and other languages. Tipu Sultan was a science geek. He collected advanced scientific instruments like barometers, clocks, and, interestingly, electrostatic devices. He had something called the Leyden jar, which was perhaps the world's first capacitor. By the time, science already knew about the existence of electrostatic charge, and they found that the Leyden jar was one way of storing this electricity. Now, Tipu Sultan understood the physics of electricity well enough to stage demonstrations for his officers, playing pranks on them by using their bodies as a conducting circle for an electrical discharge, and he was greatly amused by their bewilderment. He was, in effect, a scientist king, if you like, operating in a largely feudal landscape, a man whose only true intellectual peers in conversation, ironically, were the very people dedicated to his destruction. The flogging of Tipu Sultan reaches beyond an act of discipline. It was a time when rulers lived under perpetual threat. The boundary between a father's love and a king's surveillance dissolved. Every act of training a successor was also an act of self-preservation and strategic insurance. And the most formative lesson that Hyder Ali left his son was not territory or treasure, but an unyielding standard for discipline that Tipu carried right to the end. When Tipu Sultan died in Srirangapatna in 1799, sword in hand, defending a position that had long since ceased to be defensible, he died like his father had trained him to die, subordinating his own survival to the honor of death. There are some people who place that flogging as the device that taught him all of these things mattered more than self-preservation. It was a lesson that he remembered right to the end. So while Tipu Sultan was building his new state, there is a matter of what he did with the royals, the Wadiyars, whom Hyder had left on the throne, even if only in a ceremonial capacity. Tipu decided to end that fiction. So in January 1786, he formally declared himself sovereign, and when Chamaraj Wadiyar IX died of smallpox in 1796, Tipu simply did not appoint a successor. He wound up the institution of the Maharaja altogether and kicked the royal family out of the palace. The woman who had been fighting this dispossession longer than anyone was Lakshmi Ammani. She was the Dowager Maharani whose campaign to reclaim the Wadiyar throne long predated Tipu, and who had already shown in the affair of Khande Rao that she was not someone who accepted defeat quietly. She would outlast Hyder, she would outlast the wars, she would outlast Tipu himself. The story of Lakshmi Ammani merits its own episode, and I will bring you that in the next few episodes. Right now, we are edging closer to the start of the next Anglo-Mysore War. In the next episode, we move to the Malabar coast, long a source of both revenue and trouble for Mysore, and that became the stage for a campaign of brutal repression that will haunt Tipu's legacy to this day. Episode 109, that's coming next, will be about the Malabar atrocities. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.